Archiving started.
Well, thanks everybody for coming, my students and fellow faculty. I'm going to be talking about animal thinking, sort of coming from the question, the viewpoint of what is it like to be an animal. It's something I've always been interested in. Obviously, I should point out that we're talking about non-human animals here, because humans are animals. But when I was a biology student back in the day, and took my first 2 semesters of biology, I waited really, it felt like 2 whole semesters to get to the chapter on animal behavior, which is the very last one they covered. When we got there, though, I was really disappointed because animal behavior was sort of proposed as if animals were robots that were just simply reacting to stimulus, no thinking going on, certainly no awareness. And so that kind of, got me looking for other sources of information about animals. And the first thing I came across, most of the talk is actually based off of Donald Griffin's book, Animal Thinking, which came out in 1984. This was the first time that anybody actually pulled together evidence that shows in support of animal thinking. He's had several books since then. He actually passed away.
Put it closer to the camera.
Okay. One of the most recent ones, I think this is finished right before he died, is actually Animal Minds, where he kind of revisits some of the evidence he presented. This is in, I think it's 2003, 2004. And and there's some new stuff in here, too, that I can sort of add to some of the original material. So he starts out in Animal Thinking with this question, obviously, what do monkeys, dolphins, crows, sunfish, bees, and ants think about? You might be surprised to find the bees and ants in there, because most of them, they don't think at all. But surprisingly, there's some evidence to suggest that they're actually making some choices and thinking about things, which probably going to throw us off completely. But and so that's the central question. Now, in 1984, and even still now, the general consensus was that only humans have consciousness, animals do not. So it's foolish to even consider it. In fact, as a biology student, I was always warned against anthropomorphizing animals. You cannot put any human emotions, feelings, anything onto animals because there's no way to prove it. So that was sort of and there's still a lot of resistance to that, although we're allowing a little bit more today, but, back then there was a lot of resistance to it. So I'm going to kind of, I'm specifically looking at the question of consciousness, not just, animal emotions and things like that, but specifically, are they conscious? Which I think any casual observer would probably, if you've had any experience with animals, well, of course they are. People said they react to things and they respond, but from a scientific perspective, it's very difficult to prove consciousness. We can't even prove it in ourselves, so trying to prove it in a non-human animal is even more difficult. We're going to then look at what at least Griffin says are some things that would that we can observe is conscious behavior. And again, we can only sort of make inferences about what an animal is doing, that it's doing it consciously, but we're going to look at the examples and see if those then necessarily indicate this animal is thinking about what it's doing. He's got, in his book, several chapters that are kind of divided out by things like finding food, avoiding getting eaten, communicating with one another, all different examples of behaviors that may indicate conscious thinking, and I'm merely going to present them to you. You can decide on your own if you consider it evidence. I'll talk a little bit about whether or not we consider animals smart, because that's really a separate thing. You can be conscious, but not necessarily super smart. So those two things are separate entities, but we'll look at that briefly. And then I'm going to finish with a real sort of biological punch here and talk about the adaptive value of consciousness, where, in general, animals will be much more successful if they are conscious in doing what they need to do, rather than if they were just robots, basically. Okay, so First, I just want to briefly touch on the debate about this question. We have always held that humans are far set apart from other organisms, and so only humans are truly conscious, but you can even get some extreme philosophical viewpoints that even deny that, because where is consciousness? We don't even know where in the brain consciousness actually lives. We just know that it's produced by the brain, but we don't know exactly where. Probably a combination of different brain parts. So that's one of the debates, and of course there have been some pretty strong objections to even considering that question. Again, if this was 20 years ago, many scientists would look and go, okay, find something else to study. You're not going to get funding for that, to ask that kind of a question. Obviously, there are some pretty significant implications to it. Scientific ones, this should be a reason why we would be interested in consciousness. For example, animals are a big part of our world, and so if we can understand what their subjective experience is like, then we can better understand them and ourselves. The key is, of course, how do we study this scientifically, and I'm going to get back to that. Philosophically, again, you get into questions of what makes a human. Then if we're now kind of letting, in some ways, animals come into the realm of things like being conscious and having language, and we no longer have things that separate us really well from other organisms, and that can be troubling for some. And of course, the extension of that is moral and ethical implications. If we figure out, for example, that a bee is in fact conscious, at least part of the time, what does that mean in terms of whether you whack it with a fly swatter or not? I mean, certainly we're willing to accept consciousness in things like perhaps dogs, cats, dolphins, apes, but what about insects? So it does definitely influence how we would then treat animals and what our obligations would be to those animals. I want to just briefly talk about instinct versus learned behaviors. Again, long ago it used to be assumed that all behavior in animals was instinctive. An instinct is usually a behavior that's genetically predetermined. So, in other words, you don't have to learn how to do something, you just know how to do it. And we know that a good part of animal behavior is instinctive behavior. Some of our own behaviors are instinctive as well. But we now know, in addition to that, animals have learned behaviors. So these are behaviors that are modified through experience. So they tend to change over time. And most animals are probably working with some combination of instincts and learned behaviors. Well, it used to be commonly held that if a behavior was instinctive, then it couldn't be conscious. So if it was just genetically pre-programmed, then there was no need to be conscious. We're now finding out that doesn't have to be the case. For example, in humans, we have instinctive behaviors that we're perfectly aware of. So if you are, when you blink, something's coming at you, you're aware of yourself necessarily blinking or flinching, but, you still have the behavior.
What about phobias?
Phobias, yeah, that's a whole other thing, which I will argue that phobias to a certain degree are genetic in their basis. So common fears are things like snakes and spiders, flying things. There doesn't seem to be any, you can be afraid of something and not really know why. And so that doesn't mean you're not conscious of it though. So, and that's the point that some scientists are trying to make with animals. The learned behaviors also, I think we're more willing to accept would be accompanied by conscious thought. But even there's a lot of resistance. So I thought I guess start out with some definitions, what exactly is consciousness. And if you flip through some dictionaries, you find definitions that sort of look like this, which when you start reading through them, you start to realize that they start to become circular after a while, some of these definitions. So consciousness, state of being awake and aware of what one's doing or intending to do, having purpose and intention in one's actions. So I thought, well, what do they mean by aware? So you look that up and it says to be conscious. So end up coming back around, and it becomes very hard to define what that means. To think, is to form in the mind, conceive, a thought to have in the mind as a notion or an idea. So that's an extension of the concept of being conscious, that you have in your head an idea of what you're about to do or going to do before you do it. And again, this is really hard to prove. It's really hard to prove in people, let alone an animal that can't talk to you. So, so you can see that we get into some trouble just even defining the concept. For purposes of our discussion, and different levels of consciousness have been sort of defined. This is considered the more basic level, where if you are perceptually conscious, you are at least aware and awake, essentially. You are, aware of your surroundings. You may not be aware of yourself. That sounds bizarre, but so that's the most basic level. Reflective consciousness is a little bit more. It's what we call introspection. The idea that you can think about yourself thinking. So you're aware that you're thinking about something. And it's been commonly held that only humans can do this. Only humans can be reflective about their own internal states. And that may be true. Again, it's hard to know, but I guess the question is, where do animals fall in the spectrum, if they even fall in one of these two places? Most of the evidence that I'm going to show you seems to at least reflect a type of perceptual consciousness, so that animals are definitely aware of their environment. When we get into some of the later examples, we'll get into some areas which are kind of gray and may actually show reflective consciousness. So, okay, so the big question, and this is really the big stopping point for scientists, has always been a stopping point, is can you measure consciousness? Because in science, as you know, you must be able to quantify and measure something to study it. So this has always been the problem. One tactic to take is that, well, you can't measure it, therefore we can't study it. Well, that seems to me like a bit of a cop-out. There's got to be a way to measure it some way. It may not be a direct measurement, it may be indirect, but there's got to be a way to measure it. Two areas that are actually behavior is what we really have focused on, but obviously you could study the brain itself, the physiology of the brain, and look for evidence of what happens to the brain when, for example, a human subject is conscious. And they've done things like EEGs and PET scans and MRIs, and they do know that certain parts of the brain, at least in human subjects, will show increased activity when the person is reporting that they're aware of something. We still don't know exactly where consciousness is, though. It seems to be a combination. So the culmination of different events happening at the same time. When they've done similar studies with animals, they show similar patterns. When I say animals, I mean usually mammals. So there are similar patterns in the brain that sort of become active when the animal, we think, is conscious. What does that tell us? Well, basically that there's nothing really unique about the human brain that would tell us that we have some vast capability that's different from everybody else. So our brains are pretty much put together the same way other animals' brains are. There's like no extra little knob or anything that says, oh, there it is. Nobody else has that. There's nothing. So far, but we're still in the very early stages of looking at physiology and how that relates to consciousness. So what we're left with then really is just behavior, which, and again, behavior has to be somewhat interpreted somewhat loosely in some ways, because an animal can't usually tell you what it's thinking or feeling, or we just have to infer from its behavior. So if we're going to use behavior as criteria, we need to, actually as criteria for consciousness, we need to list what types of behavior we're looking at, not just any behavior. And this is the list that Donald Griffin came up with, which I think makes a lot of sense. So if, for example, a behavior changes depending on the circumstance, then you could definitely make a strong case that the animal is at least somewhat aware of what's going on. So being able to adapt in the moment to a changing circumstance. If the behavior was entirely hardwired, then there wouldn't be any flexibility in that behavior. So the argument then is if an animal changes what it's doing, again, in response to either others or the environment, then there's got to be at least some minimal awareness occurring. There are many behaviors in animals that are actually series of behaviors, sequences that have a definite beginning, middle, and an end. The assumption is that if you go into these series of behaviors, that an animal must have some idea of what the end result is supposed to be. So, like starting from the beginning to the end, so I'm thinking of things like, beavers building a giant dam. Strict behaviors would say, well, they have no idea what they're building, they're just building. But when you really study actual animals, you see that they at least have some minimal understanding of what that structure is supposed to do, because they make changes as they're going. And again, if you came along and destroyed the whole thing right in the middle of their construction, and they're supposed to come back the next day and just pick up where they left off, they start back from the beginning. So that's another category of evidence that seems suggestive. This one is really interesting to me, and especially if you have pets, you're probably aware of this. The anticipation/planning. Now, it's hard to prove that animals plan things, but we can definitely tell when they're anticipating something, whether it's positive or negative. And I guess the argument there is that if an animal can anticipate something, that it has to at least be minimally aware of something. It's not a current event, it's something that's happening in the future. So that must mean that they are thinking about it. So whether it's, going to the vet or about to get a treat, they're anticipating something. So, and then finally, communication. This is really where there's been a whole lot of debate in terms of what communication actually is and what constitutes a true language, with, once again, humans often being set aside as we're the only species that have true language. I guess it depends on how you define language, which, again, I've read through some of this and I still don't understand. But communication in its essence is the idea that you're conveying information that is abstract in nature. And you're not saying, here, take this. You're saying you're symbolizing something in some way, whether it's a sound, a movement, gesture. It's symbolic of something else. And so, for that reason, communication is thought to be possibly an indicator of conscious behavior. So let me start with some of the evidence presented by his books, and again, if you have any others you want to toss in there, you're welcome to. In his books, he devotes entire chapters to animals finding food. So as I talk about in my biology classes, animals are basically eating, moving machines. That's what they do. So a great deal of their time is spent trying to find food. And most animals do a really good job at it, obviously. You would expect natural selection kind of selects those individuals that are really good at finding food and keep them around. But there are some definitely more interesting ways of finding food that have been observed. These two birds here, these are actually European birds related to titmice, which are chickadees and things like that here. But not too long ago, when milk used to be delivered outside the door, there used to be milkmen and they would come and leave milk outside the door. Well, they did this in Britain as well. Some of these birds figured out that if they peeled back the little foil tops, they could get to the cream that basically, this was back in the day of full fat everything, there's no low fat. So they could get to the cream that rose to the top of the bottle. And in a very short period of time, in a matter of really weeks, an entire town was being plagued by birds that had all learned that they could jump onto the bottle, peel back the foil, and drink the cream. So everybody was going out and finding holes in their milk bottles. The question really is not so much that behavior spread, because obviously it was a learned behavior. They were picking it up off of each other. But the question is, why did the first bird do it? I mean, a milk bottle with a shiny foil top is nothing like anything in nature. What would make them want to investigate something like that? Obviously, there had to be a thought in their head that there may be something there. By the way, they switched initially to cardboard caps, which the birds could still get through. And so they finally switched to just using cartons instead of milk bottles with seals, and that pretty much solved the problem. So, but I guess so that it's no longer a widespread problem apparently, but some of these birds will still try to get into things, man-made structures. Probably even more surprising is this here, and again, it's better to show a video, can't really do that, but this is a carrion crow. This is in Japan. This bird is actually eating nuts that have actually been run over by cars. You can see that's actually in the bottom block there. Well, it's not just eating nuts that have been randomly thrown over by cars. It actually collects the nuts, puts them at the crosswalk in front of the car, waiting for the light to change. Okay? So at red light, cars line up. If they put the nuts down there, they fly back up, the light changes, cars go, red, they come back down and eat the broken nuts. And again, this is probably most definitely because of how quickly it spread among one group, that it was definitely learned behavior. But again, you have to ask, why did the first bird do it? How did they figure out that they could do this? So they're basically using cars as giant tools to run over nuts they couldn't normally break open. Okay. Again, still in the realm of actually food acquisition is sort of looking at the constant evolutionary battle between predators and their prey. So it's really sort of a continuing challenge for predators to try to outwit their prey and for prey to outwit their predators. So you might expect there to be some pretty complicated behaviors that have evolved in animals that are predatory and, of course, in their prey. Let me start with talking about one area that he spends a lot of time on in this book is cooperative hunting, which we do see in things like lions and wolves and lions I think are the only cooperative cat hunters for the most part, and then a lot of wolf species hunt in packs. It used to be, it actually still is thought by many that when a group of lions goes out to hunt, they're not planning anything. They just go out, and then if they get lucky, then they manage to kill a gazelle or a zebra. Great, good. But there's no planning. They don't, they don't really think about what it is they're about to do. Others who actually study lions more extensively have noticed that no, there's, in at least some cases, there was definitely a plan in place. When they basically came up to their prey, they thought about what was the best way to go after a certain prey item. And Donald Griffin talks about in his book, he had the opportunity to go to Africa and spend, I think he only had 2 weeks. 2 weeks to spend with lion researchers. And he went out with them every day hoping to see a cooperative hunt, and of course, as usual, they were sleeping and not much was happening. And on the very last day that he was there, had one final shot. They went out to an area where they know there was a lot of wildebeest, and which happens to be a favorite prey item of lions. And so he was in the truck with his scientific companions, and they pulled up, and they saw the road ahead of them. They saw 2 groups of wildebeest. On one side of the road was just a wide open plain, and there were hundreds of wildebeest. On the other side of the road, there was a little bit of a clearing, and behind it was just solid wood. There was a group of wildebeest that had crossed the road and was in that little clearing. So that's interesting. And at the time they were just sitting there, they noticed 4 lionesses walking towards the group, parallel to the road, basically. So I'm usually trying to draw this because it's hard to explain it, but you have road here, and then this open plain of trees. And so that's open. You have a little group of wildebeest here, and a big group over here. They're sitting in their cars, basically, and they see these lions who's coming this way. There's 4 of them. Well, what they do next was really surprising because he really wanted to see where they were all going to go. So there was 4. 2 of them approached the group calmly, and wide open, and came up to a hill, and then sat on this hill, wide open. The wildebeest could clearly see them, and the researchers confirmed that wildebeest were looking at the lions, going, "Oh, they're there, okay." And in most cases, if you know where the lions are, you're good, right? They were sitting here calmly. Well, they continued to wait. They noticed the 3rd lioness had actually dropped down into a ditch. that was next to the road and started slinking forward. So below the site, basically, of either group of wildebeest. And it just kind of hung out there, like next to the road. A few minutes passed, and then sort of all at once, a fourth lioness came from here, from behind, rushed out of the woods, and sent this group right across the road. And in the process, this lioness jumped up, grabbed one, pulled it down, and within a few minutes, it was done. So when he described this example to other behaviorists, they're like, no, there's no way they could have planned that. That was random. They just happened to all be in the right place at the right time. But it's hard not to look at that example and think that there was some intent going on there. So how they planned it, I have no idea. You know, how they decide who's going to sit where to do what, I really have no idea. But I've actually, years ago, I saw this example again in the box, and he was so blown away by it. I don't know, I start to argue against there at least being a little bit of planning going on. The pictures of the birds I have here are actually meant to illustrate another phenomenon that's very common in defense. It's what we call predator distraction displays, where this is mostly in birds, where birds will actually try to distract the predator away from the nest or babies. Okay? Now, as a bird researcher, I've actually been the victim of this many times. So you get close to a nest, whether or not you know the nest is there, and the bird will kind of all of a sudden go into an elaborate display to get your attention. You all right there? Yes.
No, there's a camera.
Okay. I have this, you probably can't see it really well, but this bird here, this is called a killdeer, which has flutter, and it's very well known for its infamous broken wing display, which if there's a predator, like say a fox is coming up near to its nest, the adult, seeing the fox, will get right in front of the fox, the predator, and drop its wing and drag it on the ground and look really pathetic, having him flail around, calling loudly, because its tail feathers spread, very, very obvious. The fox will see that and go, oh, look at that, an injured bird, and follow the bird. Now, first, again, scientists said, oh, that bird is just, it has conflicting stimuli, so it's just going into a seizure. That's all I'm saying. Seriously. But it's very clear that's not what's happening, because the bird will pay attention to what that predator is doing and then adjust its behavior. So if the fox, for example, ignores the parent and keeps going towards the nest, the parent will stop, fly up and get right around in front of them again, and continue the display, all the while keeping a very close eye on that predator to see what it's doing. I've had birds do this to me, and there's no doubt that they are looking at you, making sure that you're following them. And if you don't, they will change their behavior. So here's an example of being able to adapt to a situation. So it's not just an automatic knee-jerk response. They just do this when they see a predator. They only do it when they have babies or eggs, only. And they have different responses to different types of predators as well. So it's different for a fox versus a hawk. Actually, for hawks, they don't even do that. They just call loudly and flap around. One of my favorite examples, well, I should say favorite of students probably, blue jays. Of course, blue jays don't do I've never seen them do the broken wing display, but years ago I found a blue jay nest, and it was a very long pathway, and I thought, oh, this is cool. And then I noticed the parent sitting there, kind of close, and the parent was sitting there extremely calmly. And I thought, well, maybe you can just sense, I like birds. And in the middle of that thought, from behind, its mate came and whacked me on the head. I mean, from behind, I didn't even see it. And so, of course, I abruptly moved away, but I'm to this day, I think back to that bird. I was just sitting there going, oh. So, it's really hard to argue that these animals are just not thinking about what they're doing, that they're just reacting, but there's definitely some thought going on. And again, there's a ton more examples there, but there. Okay. In both of these books, Animal Minds and Animal Thinking, Donald Griffin spends some time talking about what he calls artifacts and templates. For him, an artifact is anything that an animal constructs that is for the purposes of itself or its babies, or a good example of that, of course, would be bird nests. And of course, the typical argument is that, well, birds just know how to build a nest. It's genetically pre-programmed, but they don't have to think about it. And that's probably true. I mean, it's probably true to a certain degree that they know how to do something, but and maybe they're not aware of the end result. But the evidence seems to suggest otherwise. So in experiments with bird nests, experimenters have come in and manipulate the nest sort of halfway through their building process, and the birds usually respond appropriately. They don't just continue as if nothing has happened. They will adjust what they're doing next depending on what happens. If you come in and knock the nest down halfway through, they'll either start over or just abandon the site and go somewhere else. We've also seen lots of cases of, I guess we can call it improvisation. That's my word I'm using, but where birds will be inventive in terms of using nesting material. So they will use what is available in a sensible way, usually. So if they don't have feathers, then they will find maybe fur instead. If they don't have pine needles, they'll find small twigs instead. So they are able to select materials that do make sense for the construction of this nest. Again, one of my more favorite examples, and also mentioned here, is this, and it's hard to see. This is actually not a nest. This is what's called a bower. And these are bowerbirds. Well, that's one species. There's a couple dozen species of bowerbirds, but that's a male satin bowerbird, and he builds this thing, which is designed solely to attract a female. And I don't know if you can notice from there, but you see all that blue around there? Well, he specifically collects brightly colored objects and arranges them around the bower. The idea is that the female will come down, she inspects everything. She checks the color. What am I hearing? What are we getting into? I don't know. She'll inspect the bower, even poke a little bit up, pull at it, make sure it's down. If she happens to like it, then she'll basically invite the male to mate with her, and then she flies off and basically raises kids on her own. So it's sort of her way of selecting who's the best male. Well, what's really interesting about these birds is that they keep rearranging things if their versions are not successful. When they just build a bower, plop a few things down and wait. They constantly change it and update it. So it's not getting a lot of visits by females. They will come in here and rearrange, regroup, try this over here, try this over here. Almost as if they have some artistic sense. And what scientists notice about the bowers, and this is just one shape, some of them are just huge and elaborate. There's some pictures in one of the books. They can be 10 feet huge. Is that birds will tend to choose colors of things that are typically rare in that particular environment. So blue is hard to find in this particular environment where these birds live, usually New Guinea and Australia. So I guess showing that this male can find a lot of blue things means that he's pretty good. Go out and find stuff, and the color can vary too. They've actually looked at the same species of bowerbirds but living in different locations, and they look at their color preferences, and it seems to match with what's rare in that particular local environment. Again, with the rearranging part. Now, the thing about these guys is it takes them years to perfect the skill. It takes young male bowerbirds at least 3 years before they can actually build a bower that even has a chance of attracting a female. So it's definitely a huge learning curve. And young males will often visit older males' bowers and watch them.
There's a movie waiting to be
Yeah. Well, there's also a lot of theft and a lot of sabotage that occurs. There's actually, the more dominant male in an area will go and steal from other males. They've been known to go and destroy other males' bowers. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
So, again, very complex behavior, and I don't know if I would go so far as to say that they have an artistic sense, but when you watch these birds arranging things and pick them up and look and put it down, they decide, no, I don't like it there, remove it. I mean, there's got to be some thought. Sorry. Yes. Tools in engineering. I used to be taught that humans were the only ones that use tools. We're wrong. We've been wrong for a while, but animals clearly use tools. But even more than that, not only do they use them, they can often make them, fashion them themselves. And obviously it's not to the level of what humans do, but there's clearly tool use that occurs. This is a woodpecker finch in the Galapagos Islands. This is a bird that routinely will select cactus spines and use that to probe, because its short little bill is not really good at getting into cavities and finding food. So that's clearly tool use. Chimpanzees, of course, are known for their ability to use tools, and they will often modify their tools as well. So if they have twigs that are using, maybe to get termites out of a mound, they'll adjust the length if necessary. If they have a tool, for example, a rock that's really good at smashing stuff open, they'll hang on to it. They'll keep it and use it repeatedly. So again, it's no longer correct to say that only humans use tools, but animals do as well. And unfortunately, I wish I could show you the video, but you can probably Google it. There's a absolutely fantastic video on YouTube of a species of crow where, now this particular species of crow is known to be regular tool users, but in laboratory settings, not only do they use tools, but they will take a piece of wire and they know how to bend it to form a hook to get something out of a tube. And so they're clearly having to assess the problem, think of the solution, make it, and then make it happen. So that's sort of higher levels. That's not just slapping a rock into something, that's actually fashioning a tool to do a specific job. And there are other examples as well. When you think of otters that carry stones around to whack open the muscles, birds that regularly will drop rocks onto things, or if it's food item, they'll often carry it up to the air and drop it because they know that hitting the ground will open it. So, and again, genetically, probably there is a predisposition for that behavior, but there's definitely a learning curve. Their aim does get better over time. So, yes. Okay, communication. There's a whole field here, and again, this is where some of the most fierce battles are occurring, I guess, between the folks that say that animals are not conscious and the ones that do, is in the realm of communication. Again, language seems to be one thing that really sets us apart from other animals, which is definitely true, I agree. But I wanted to give you two examples. They're kind of two very different examples. The first one here is one that totally blew my mind the first time I read it because it kind of distorts all my preconceived notions about insects. And the second one is a little bit more familiar, talking about parrots. But let's talk about honeybees for a moment. Honeybees, of course, they're social animals. Usually have a queen that is the only reproducing member of the hive. And all the workers are usually, typically they're all female and they're all genetic sisters as well. Males typically have relatively short lifespans compared to females, and they're only there really to fertilize the queen. So almost everything we're talking about here we're talking about female worker bees. Beekeepers often noticed that when bees came back to the hive after foraging, they would perform this weird wiggling movement. Okay? It wasn't until someone sat down and actually started to study that they figured out this was actually a message. And they call it now the waggle dance because of the way the bee moves. But what they figured out is that when a worker bee finds a food source that is particularly desirable, it takes a sample of it, brings it back, gives a little bit to each of the other workers, and then it does this dance, which we decoded the language, but basically it transfers three pieces of information. How far away the food source is, in one direction relative to the sun do they need to go, and how desirable. okay? And again, it's a series of basically the bee will walk a straight line and then loop, walk a straight line and then loop. And all the time they're kind of waggling back and forth. And if you watch videos of this, all the other bees are like crowded right around this bee that's doing it. And you have to remember, this is in the pitch black of a hive. They're not, it's completely black in there. So they're just kind of following the motion. And then after she's done, these workers fly off and go to that food source. And they've done experiments where they've actually put out artificial food sources. And they've let the bees find them, go back, tell everybody else where it is, and sure enough, the bees will come within minutes to that spot. So they know that they're communicating information. Here's the thing that really blew my mind though, is that bees will only report the location of the food source that they're low on. So not just any food, it has to be something that they're missing and they absolutely need. So do they have a shopping list in their head? So when they go out, they're thinking, oh, we got plenty of this. Ooh, we need some of this. I'm going to go back and tell everybody about this one. And so there's got to be some level of awareness going on, at least minimally, for them to be able to keep track of what it is they need. And then the language itself is probably one of the most symbolic languages there is in the entire animal kingdom. We don't even know exactly how all the information is conveyed other than it's just this dance pattern. But what they've also found when they studied these other workers is that the workers can judge based on the information from the dance. Well, is this really worth me going out there for? For example, that bees don't like to fly over water. So when researchers sort of trick bees into thinking that a food source is over water, more often than not, they decide not to go for it. So they're deciding that they're not going to go for the food source because they don't like to fly over water, they'd rather fly over land. Or researchers will experimentally move their food source. Bees will show up where it's supposed to be based on the information that's told to them and not find it. So we know that they're talking to each other, it's just in a very symbolic way. So when you think about whether it's bee colonies or even ant colonies, how they're sort of working together, what kind of communication they may have, and I'm thinking about this now because I'm having an ant infestation in my kitchen, and I'm kind of torn still, so whether I'm just killing them all or I don't know. But anyways, so that's the one end of the spectrum, okay, and that really stretches our limits of thinking about animal consciousness. The other, of course, looking at something like a parrot, which although the parrots can, mimic human sounds, the critics will say that's all they're doing, they're imitating. They have no idea what they're saying, and that's probably true for good many birds. But there have been several now well-documented experiments, in addition to, yes, anecdotal data coming from parrot owners, but the data suggests that in at least some cases these birds know what they're saying. They're uttering a word with a specific purpose. So this is Alex, who has since passed away, unfortunately. Alex was one of the first birds, I think probably the first bird that was used in a language experiment. And this is the book that just came out here. If you're interested at all, this is a fabulous book. This is Dr. Arlene Pepperberg. And when she first proposed that she was going to study language using parrots, everybody laughed at her. Everybody did. And they actually laughed at her for quite a while. Even after she was publishing and showing that, this bird knows stuff. But Alex, I think, learned, by the time he died, I think he had a vocabulary of about 200 words. And her experiments were so well designed to make sure that there was no way that the parrot could be like reading you and getting signs from you. It's sort of like, a horse that could tap out a certain number, if the guy said tap out 30 or whatever, the horse could do it. But what they figured out, the horse was just reading his body language, and he would have a subtle change in his body to indicate when he was getting close to the right number. To avoid that, she would have people who Alex was not super familiar with, or in some cases, the person who was asking the question about was not actually seeing what he was seeing. So there's no way that he could influence his answers. So you see him here presented with a tray of blocks, and he got to the point where you could ask him, of these objects, what's different? And he would say color. Or he could be presented with a tray of items that were all the same color but different shapes. And be asked, what's different? No, the shape. So, it took a long time. This was years and years of experiments, or actually training, I should say, to get him to learn these words. But the testing they did, there's really no doubt the meaning of these words. Now, of course, in science, in order to be really credible, you have to be able to reproduce your evidence. So they have 2 additional birds that they brought into training that they're trying to, while Alex was alive, they were trying to actually help have Alex tutor them, at least to a certain degree, which she wasn't always amenable to doing. But what was most interesting to me, of course, the experiments themselves are interesting, but the stuff that happened in between, outside the experiments was also interesting. She set up a camera in his cage, so when everybody went home for the night, there was a camera running, recording, and he would often be sitting there repeating and rehearsing the words that he was being taught that day. So like kids do, or he was practicing, kind of going through the same thing over and over and over again until they got it right. He was known to be moody, so if he didn't want to participate, he would just say, want to go back, which meant back to my page, I'm not participating, and he would simply not answer questions. There was one case in which Alex was definitely messing around with his human investigators, so they would ask him a question which they knew he knew the answer to, and he was giving all kinds of random answers, just obviously on purpose, because they knew he knew the answer. Well, there was one time when they were trying to ask, they had 2 objects out, and they were trying to ask, well, how many? He could count 6. He said 1, 4, 5. Okay, we know you know this. How many? 4, 6. And finally, Dr. Pepper was like, okay, fine, you go into timeout. So she brought him, put him behind a door, closed the door, and all of a sudden he's like, 2, it's 2. I'm sorry. Come back. I'm sorry. That's literally what he was saying. So he knew what the answer was, he just didn't feel like answering. So, I guess that's what you can call deception. That's sort of an extra level of behavior. You have to have some awareness of what you're trying to do, and also be aware of what the response is going to be to do that. Now, of course, we don't have another parrot like Alex yet. He has 2 protégés that they're working with that are not near the level that Alex was, and so a lot of people will say, well, he was just a bizarre exception. But I know other people that have parrots that will, they're anecdotal stories, but will give similar stories about them using words appropriately at the right time. So that means that they know what the meaning is. They know what the meaning is. Maybe not me, but. Okay. Try to speed up a little bit. Play. The idea of playing in animals has always been hotly debated. With, again, the strict behaviors will say, well, animals only play to practice behaviors they'll need to survive. So you might say, oh, kittens playing with something, they're practicing a behavior. They'll need those skills to be able to catch, treat, and survive. We might be able to grant that. Okay? But there are examples of playing in animals that clearly have no survival benefit whatsoever. Dolphins play. They will play with objects. They will, one of the most interesting things they've been observed to do is they will imitate other animals. So, and now of course we know this from captive situations, but dolphins that share a tank with seals have been known to imitate them, sort of like float sideways, and sort of swim like they do. For what reason? I don't know. It becomes extremely hard for the behaviors to explain. Well, why do they do that? I don't know. There's got to be some reason. Maybe they just think it's fun. But again, you can't prove that, so therefore we can't say that. So another video I really wanted to show you, but you can Google this on YouTube, is of a cockatoo. God, I could not stop watching this video, that could dance. And by dancing, I don't just mean just like jumping around. It kept time with the music. So this is not just random spastic movements. This bird is actually keeping time, which is thought to be a much higher level of behavior than just moving. And if you actually, I guess, talk about his name is Snowball, the cockatoo, if you Google that, you'll find him. The one I was going to show was actually another cockatoo, different species, known as Frosty. And they've done experiments, especially with Snowball, because it became an instant internet hit because of dancing, where they've taken like one of his favorite songs and they've purposely slowed it down. And they filmed him. And his behavior, his dancing still matches the beat, whether you slow it down or speed it up. So he's not just randomly, and why he does it? I have no idea. He just randomly did it, I guess, and he loves to do it, and he will dance through an entire song. There's one video I saw of him dancing to The Edge of 17 by Stevie Nicks, which is like a 6-minute song. He danced the whole thing without stopping, and then at the end was waiting for another song to start. So, to me, that's kind of mind-boggling, but that becomes really difficult for scientists to explain, because we have no explanation for that. So beyond the idea of consciousness, I guess we get into the smart, because as I said at the beginning, being conscious and being smart, not necessarily the same thing. So I already talked about the tool using crow, and again, that was the crow from the New Caledonian crow. That there's a video of her. She's actually bending that hook to get food out of a little device that they created. Talk about the dolphins and imitation. You all know about chimpanzees learning sign language. Of course, they've been taught that. And they seem to really understand what it is they're signing. Of course, they've been taught to use keyboards as a way to communicate. Of course, the real test is for them to be able to, I guess, use the language in a different way than they've been taught. And in some cases, they do. They've made up signs for things that are, just like kids do. They make up a sign for something that makes more sense to them, and they continue to use it. Alex, they could not get him to say apple. For the life of him, they could not get him to say apple. He wanted to call it a banberry, which was, I guess, because it looked like a giant cherry, and he combined that with banana, and they could not change his mind. So forever after him, an apple was a banberry. So chimpanzees then can ask their keepers what they wanted. So I want this, I want that. And if you give them the wrong thing, they will react as if, just like a child would if you gave them the wrong thing. I don't want this, I want this. And Alex was the same way. He said, I want a grape, and you try to give him a banana, we'll throw it down and say, I want a grape. So, when a kid does this, we don't deny the kid is conscious and thinking about what it wants, but somehow we tend to do it with animals. Probably the most strict test of intelligence is known as the self-awareness test. It's a mirror test, right? So whether or not you or an animal can look into a mirror and recognize that is me and not another individual, or in many cases, animals just don't respond at all. We've only seen self-awareness in certain groups of organisms. So what that means, I don't know, but it has definitely been demonstrated. So chimpanzees learn that when they see themselves in the mirror, that is them. So, they'll look behind the mirror and realize there's nobody there. And then they'll look in the mirror and do things like this. They'll touch their face and see that they're touching themselves. So they know this. I was reading here about elephants, so they did test elephants that said, elephants don't recognize themselves. But recent tests I've seen actually, where they'll actually take some paint it on a part of the elephant. So the elephant normally can't see unless they're shown it in a mirror. And when the elephants see it, they'll take their chest and go, what is that? So that is what's called self-awareness, and that's where we're getting to higher levels of consciousness. So a dog, cat, unfortunately, they don't look into a mirror and recognize it themselves. At least not that we know. So at least among some animals there is that higher level, and we may have others we've yet to figure out. I'm going to finish with this last piece, and now I'm going really back into biology mode here, is in all my biology classes that I teach, and everybody teaches, one of the big underlying currents, right, is the idea of evolution and the idea of natural selection. So animals have certain characteristics because those characteristics enable them to survive. If you consider consciousness an adaptation, then it is a super one, because if an animal is able to consider options and think about what it's doing, it is much more likely to succeed than if it were just running off of a program of just a limited suite of behaviors. This, I think, is maybe one of the most powerful arguments for consciousness, is that it has significant adaptive value, that animals that are conscious are more likely probably to survive, escape their predators, find food, interact with other organisms, and therefore pass their genes on. So I'm still surprised, as was Donald Griffin, at how much resistance there still is to the idea of accepting consciousness in other animals, but I think we've just scratched the surface. And it's up to us to really come up with better ways to test for consciousness in other animals, because I have no doubt that it's there. One of the quotes that struck me really interesting is that one of the critics of people who believe in animal consciousness, well, they'll say, okay, well, primates maybe. Primates are, they're natural psychologists. Even in chimpanzees, we know that they are able to read each other and interpret and it's necessary for their survival. Well, humans, as primates, we do a lot of that too. And if our sense is telling us that cat is looking at me, was perfectly aware of what it was doing when it did that, then it probably was. I mean, why do we doubt our own instinct to want to believe that in another animal if we're not willing to allow that chimpanzees can read other animals? My last slide. This is my cat, who has a fondness for sitting in bags. Do I know why or what she's thinking? No idea. But every bag I put out, she'll be in it. If anybody has an explanation for that, I'm willing to hear them. Do you all have any questions, comments? Yeah.
It's recognizing oneself as a mirror. The idea is that if you see that as yourself, then you can liken yourself to everybody else. I mean, you kind of objectify yourself.
Right.
In other words, the universe doesn't center on me. I'm one of that. Is that right?
I guess, or it's just more, if you are aware of yourself, then you have the ability to be aware of your own thoughts, which is in that second level of consciousness that we were talking about, was considered to be more advanced. I don't know, it's hard for us to it's hard for me to think about it because I think I'm aware of myself, but there's a lot of things that we do that we're not aware of. I mean, even in humans, there's a lot of behaviors, a lot of input that we are not conscious of. In fact, probably most of the brain's working is unconscious working that we're not even aware of, only a tiny percentage. So, I don't know, self-awareness has always been one of those things that, not just I am here in this world, that's food, that's predator, but that in the mirror, that's me, as opposed to another animal.
I actually have another question that has to do with this. When the animals learn things from each other, like crows learn secrets, seems to me to learn something, to see somebody else doing something and then do it yourself, also kind of requires you to think of yourself as somebody else.
Right.
Another individual.
I know. We often tend to dismiss imitation as sort of a lower form of learning. They're just imitating. But we do it too. I mean, we learn by watching, and there's no doubt that animals learn from each other. Yeah, you could definitely make the argument that is, again, in that higher level of thinking that, if I did that, I would get the same reward, benefit. Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, just using the same species, is there any, like, for example, you have like cats, is there any level of people consciousness difference like humans? Like all humans are not like equally smart, right?
Right, again, we have to be careful of the consciousness and smart being two different things. I think with humans anyways, we know that we are all aware that we're conscious at least part of the time. So the assumption is that, you know, all humans are conscious. Now, in terms of intelligence level, I suppose that can vary. I would expect it to be similar with animals. So if we grant consciousness, you know, if we assume that chimpanzees are conscious, then they probably all are. But where you see the differences is maybe how smart they are. And again, if you've had pets, you probably know there's that one cat or dog you've had that was smarter than everybody else, and they're individuals just like we are. So there's just as much variability in them as there is in us. Anything else? Any other? Yeah.
I was watching some on TV, like elephants in Africa somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and they're convinced that their language is the whole vocabulary and everything. And I think it has to do with that infrasound.
Right. I was trying to read through one of the chapters in Don Grisham's book Animal Minds talks about communication and why the critics are saying no. Communication in animals is not true language because there's no words, no syntax, and et cetera, et cetera. And I was just like barely hanging on by a thread trying to understand what he was saying. But I think the fact that there is so much of it that we still don't know should be read enough to really look at this with full force. And just because it may be not a language we understand doesn't mean it's not a language. So, I mean, someone speaks Spanish to me and I don't understand a word of it, but, you know, it doesn't mean it's not a true language. It's just a different one. So I'm fascinated, well, I like birds, but I'm fascinated especially with parrots because they're the only ones that actually can speak to us in our language. And you can ask them point-blank questions and they can answer you. So that to me is sort of like, seems to me sort of an ideal study subject, to use an animal that can talk back. But
Does that go back to imitation?
well, again, it is possible that a lot of what parrots do is simply imitation. And simply, again, it's probably not the best word, but the studies with Alex and other parrots, and again, stories from parrot owners are suggesting that at least in some cases the parrots know the meanings of the words they say. So there's one story I was reading, I think it was, I can't remember where I was reading about I think it was a kid that, lives in someone's home. There was an escape artist that commonly keeps getting out of his cage, and the woman owned a dog as well. And of course, getting out of the cage is dangerous because the dog was sometimes grass bird. But I guess the lady came home one day, and there was the bird in the dog's mouth. And the bird was yelling, "Help! Help!" It was actually yelling, "Help!" And she kept saying to the dog, "Put the bird down. Put it down," because the dog was not responding. And finally the bird said, "Put the bird down." And the dog dropped the bird. So it could have been random, but probably not. Now, again, I'm not saying all parrots are equally smart and know exactly what they're saying, but there's suggestive evidence that they do.
Well, that came in, so back to the imitation. Did you see the gorilla that walked?
Yes, I've seen that video.
Now,
Yeah.
if that was evolution, there should be many others. I think walking on two, but could it possibly be imitation? Could it happen to imitate humans walking on two?
In that case, probably more likely to be either imitation or just his hands hurt if you do just one go walk over there and and of course when you see something like this behavior in an individual, that's not at the level of what we call evolution. That evolution requires usually whole genetic change, but but I mean everyone I'm struck by this all the time is that, you know, critics are saying, oh, you have animals just imitate, they're just imitating, that has no meaning, but we wear fur coats, we paint ourselves up, and we name buildings after animals and cars after animals, and we do the same thing. We imitate, copy.
Diane, there's a question coming in. Okay, it says here, hi, I have a question about animal alliances. Some say dolphin and higher primates' intelligence and even brain size is explained by their need to form alliances. Could you comment?
Well, there's definitely a relationship between animals that live in societies and I guess what we perceive as their level of intelligence. So if you look at a dolphin, their brain to body ratio is the same as ours. So they have just as big brains as we do relative to their body size. It probably isn't a coincidence that we see some of the most interesting behaviors in animals that do live in societies, like primates and dolphins or wolf parrots, which are also very social. That seems to demand a kind of a higher level of reasoning because, again, you have to be able to read what everybody else in the group is doing and interpret the information correctly, because if not, it could mean you get beat up or killed or whatever. So there is that thinking that, yes, that living in groups tends to make animals smarter. I guess that might be one way to put it.
Okay, there's another question here. My question is she aware of the elephant study with the researcher ascertaining the language of elephant herds in Africa, and why wasn't this included in your presentation?
I was only minimally aware of it, so I've heard of it, but I don't know that much about it. But yeah, that goes back to what we're talking about, is do non-human animals have true language, as we like to define it and separate ourselves, but, and unfortunately I just don't know that much about it. I think because it's relatively recent stuff. If I did know about it a lot more, I probably would have agreed with it. Anything else?
I think it's very true, like research, like comparing animals with like real humans. I mean, because like humans, even just newborn babies, they don't know anything.
Right.
So,
And they're probably not completely conscious for at least a while. I mean, they react, but there is some evidence that they're not really completely aware, at least for the first few months of life. But yeah, so I mean, it would be interesting to see, well, what part of the brain has to develop before they get to that point where they are aware. And, you know, this has all kinds of implications for people as well who have brain injuries where, you know, if something, you know, some people have, like, memory issues or, you know, they may develop problems with, like, one side of the brain, and the other side of the brain can learn to take over. And so it would help us a lot to know more about consciousness in general, just in terms of how we approach medicine with people.
also just some animals like cats, they, for us, even dogs, they recognize it. You know, when I was back home, there was a cat, she used to care over that. So whatever sees us, whenever it sounds, run out. So, you know,
they actually do recognize individuals. They know who's friendly, who's not friendly. There's definitely no doubt about that. So again, I think an animal will do that without being conscious. They just can't do that. But any other questions, comments, stories? I got stories on the law too. I just learned it, but we don't have all day. So I do have some books up here. The two by Don Griffin, these are not the only two that he wrote, but this is like the beginning and the most recent one that sort of capped the end of his work. And again, this book came out a few years before he died. If you're at all interested in it, in this topic, I would definitely recommend Animal Thinking, the first and this one. And if you're especially interested in, like, Alex, this book that just came out, I think it was a year or two ago, is fabulous. And actually, now, it's almost like the floodgates have opened a bit So now there's a ton of books. You know, you go to Barnes and Noble and you'll see books about, here it is, When Elephants Weep, The Emotional Lives of Animals, Conversations with Animals, and this is by, I haven't really read this one, about an animal communicator, you know, that can completely read animals, don't know much about it. This is specifically about birds, bird brains, and looking at actually corvids, crows and ravens, and they're smart. This one, actually, I just recently read, of course, because I'm bird geek, but birdology, and there's a whole chapter here about parrots, including the dancing cockatoo and Alex. So there's a lot of stuff out there to read if you're interested. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Thank you so much for coming.
So actually, the next talk might fit pretty well with the communications. Because it's going to be about oh, we'll see back there. It's about the deaf people and, you know, their culture, you know, their sign language. And I mean, obviously that's a different way of communicating, you know, that some animals might be better at than, you know, voice, because they don't have the same anatomical structure.
But it's amazing when you think about, you know, like dogs, for example, like on these puker animals that know what pointing means to something. They know to look where you're pointing. They do that to a cat, and they're like, yeah. But so that is really interesting. They probably use more body language than anything. We all Phew.
Did a nice lady speak?
Archive recording has